Well, thank you for having me here, even to do this. I think everyone who traveled will agree that any chance you get to come to New Zealand and have it count as a work trip, you kind of have to capitalize on that. So appreciate being asked to be here. And a little bit about, so a lot of what I like to do with the research is, I still read pretty much every paper that I come across, or kind of bookmark it and put them into like little categories, so I know if I have issues later on a certain thing, I can kind of browse through certain topics. And what I like to do with the research is I kind of use it as like a means of inspiration for like questioning our process, or trying new ingredients, or just understanding some of our results as well. So a lot of what I'm talking about today is just kind of what's been on my mind as it relates to some of our processes, and maybe that'll translate a little bit with some of yours based off your equipment. And there's so many variables that changes all of our approaches to making beer. So diving in here, I guess I should say too just a little bit about Sapwood, so you kind of know where we're coming from in terms of how I'm kind of presenting a lot of this. We're a pretty small brewery. We're about 1,000 barrels. I should have done that. Should have translated that for you, but it's pretty small. We'll probably do about 50% more next year. Fairly big, well, actually pretty medium-sized mixed firm program. It's only like 70, 80, mostly wine barrels. That's kind of in a separate little spot. And then of course we do, I focus a lot on hops, so we're doing, an IPA, double IPA, pale ale once a month for each one of those. It's kind of like brew a pale, harvest, do a double IPA off of that, and that's kind of how we've been operating for the last couple of years, actually. So 10-barrel direct fire system, doing a lot of double brews into 20-barrel tanks. So that's kind of the thought process and the equipment we have as I'm going through some of this. These are the main sources of where I get a lot of the information. If this is the kind of stuff that gets your juices flowing, maybe you should consider subscribing to some of these. It's usually a couple $100 for each one, and then you have access to all their past papers, as well as I think it's every quarter they usually put out 5 to 7 more. So it's worth subscribing if this is something you're interested in. I just like to start with, this is a graph or image I had put together for the book, and it's probably a good sort of start of the day as everyone's talking about hops and hop compounds, just to kind of get a visual of the different, the 3 main classes of hop compounds and kind of how they represent the total oil of the hop. So here, the top one is the hydrocarbons. That's like the biggest portion of the hop, usually about, it can be up to like 70–80% of the hop's total oil. And then you got that mid-range one is the oxygen-containing compounds. And that's your linalool, geraniol, those types of things. And then of course the thiols, which will be discussed a lot today, is that very bottom tier, and that's although they're just like less than 1% of a hop's total oil, of course their sensory threshold is low, and so can have a dramatic impact. So here's just a little bit more on those 3 classes. Again, hydrocarbons, think like myrcene, caryophyllene. These are extremely volatile compounds, so they're harder to get in your beer, to keep in your beer. The kettle will drive a lot of these off, fermentation will. And they're generally spicy, kind of herbal, resinous, woody in nature, compared to like the monoterpene alcohols, which are a little fruitier. And a lot more polar. So those monoterpene alcohols, and a lot of the old studies would use things like linalool as like the basis of how hoppy a beer was. So if there's a lot of linalool, they'd say that's a hoppier beer. And I think in a lot of ways, although hydrocarbons are hard to get in your beer, if you're doing a lot of hazy beers, I think it was Dr. John Paul May's research that found that viscosity level of some of those hazy IPAs was actually kind of like acting as like a carrier for some of these hydrocarbons that kept them in solution at higher rates than say like a West Coast IPA, for example. So, that's why you might have some more of those kind of resinous green characteristics that might stick around in a hazy beer compared to like a West Coast IPA. And so I'll go through a couple of ways of how I think about trying to reduce some of those as I'm dry hopping because of the more viscous nature of those beers. Again, monoterpene alcohols, I think these are like big complexity builders, just trying to push as many of these into the fermenter and final beer as I can in terms of just the synergy with thiols, and it's just building a complex beer. I think just really just trying to chock as much hop oils as you can into that fermenter. And thiols, the main ones are 3MH, 3MHA, 4MMP, and 3S4MP, which is the Nelson thiol, which is, I think it's interesting, a lot of that work was done by some researchers at Sapporo, who I don't think they ever use the hop. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's nice of them to do some of that dirty work for us. So 3MH rich hops, Pato was very high. That was in a Yakima Chief study. 4MMP, that's more of like the black currant one that you'll get in mostly through dry hopping. And then again, 3S4MP, which is kind of the Nelson one. And I wonder if some of the other New Zealand varieties have some of that as well. But just quickly on thiols, I know there's gonna be a lot of talk on thiols, so I can kind of skip that for the most part today. But this is just a image I like to show. It just kind of shows how much there's so much bound potential in these hops, particularly when it comes to thiol precursors. And in more particular, bound 3MH, you can see that middle, so like a free thiol will kind of get in your beer a little easier, and then a bound has to be, have the right enzyme to kind of free it. And so you can see how much more potential there is in the bound. That's not so much the same with 4MMP, obviously, but so that's just an example of the potential of the bound thiols and hops. But I think Laura will probably take care of the rest of that, so I'll skip the thiol talk today. When it comes to hazy beers, but just IPAs in general, I'm a huge fan of hot side hopping. I think that's one of the things that gets pushed to the side a lot on a lot of the IPAs that I've tried from other breweries and friends. It's I think that start, it was kind of like no hops in the kettle, let's just push dry hops as much as possible. But to me, I mean, the goal is really to build like a complex beer, but one that's also very balanced. And I think in order to do that with like super heavy dry hopping loads is to have a good hop saturated base that can withstand that heavy dry hopping. So we're dry hopping at about 2 pounds per barrel, which is about 7 to 8 grams per liter in our whirlpool. And we're really adjusting the temperature of the whirlpool to kind of satisfy the IBU target we're after. And so sometimes, if we're double batching, we'll do like super low alpha hops on the first one, so we don't have to cool the whirlpool. So like Crystal or something like that. And then we'll just cool that second whirlpool to like 170, 160, add higher alpha hops, just to kind of get us in the IBU range we're after. This is just kind of my opinion, but in beers that I've had that are heavily dry hopped, that don't have a lot of hot side hopping, they can become very kind of flimsy, flat. Like they're the ones to me that are the most astringent too. I just think that there's something about pumping in those hot side compounds that kind of help make a balanced beer. And then I like Yakima Chief's survivable research, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with at this point. But essentially, it's like working backwards from your final beer. It's like, okay, we have this hoppy beer. What compounds are in it, and what classes of these compounds are in it? And then we look at which hops have a large volume of those classes of compounds. So we know like those are important hop compounds that are sticking through the whole process, the boil, the whirlpool, the fermentation. And for us, it was really eye-opening because we were at the time, before this came out, we're using a lot of Idaho 7 in the whirlpool because we were just surprised by how well it would withstand the process. I mean, there's a lot of hops that you can load up in the whirlpool, and if you taste it before dry hopping or smell it before dry hopping, you don't really get a lot of that hop variety-specific flavor, aroma. But when it came to Idaho 7, we were kind of shocked by how much it came through. And so this is, when they came out with this research, it was kind of, it gave us some confidence of why. I mean, it's one of those hops you see here. It's second on the list, or third on the list, but Cryopop is the blend they put together that's just high in their cryo blend that's high in these survivable compounds. So it's, Idaho 7 is next to Centennial is one of those hot side hops that really carry through, that just their class of compounds just withstand the process. So we generally like to use high survivable hops in the whirlpool, just trying to get our biggest bang for the buck. Not on here is Rawaka wasn't studied, and hopefully it probably will be coming up as there's a partnership there. But that's another one of those hops that just a little bit on the hot side. We are just kind of shocked by how well it comes through, especially if you're doing like a lager or something. It's pretty. Although the hop can be kind of expensive, it's an awesome hot side hop, and you don't have to use a ton of it. Moving on to, this is something that's kind of caught my eye. There's been a handful of studies lately on iron levels in beers, and things you can do or things to think about to kind of reduce these levels. Of course, IPAs in general, or hazy IPAs, can really kind of go downhill quick with oxidation. I'm sure you've all seen some of that. And I think I'm fairly sensitive to that. A lot of hoppy beers, if they sit warm for a little bit or whatever, just kind of have that stale hop taste that kind of comes to like a neutral hoppy thing. So anything you can do to, have a higher shelf life of your beer is obviously important. And looking at some of this recent research, this was from 2023. Obviously when you're in your mash, you're using all these grains, and they are extracting a lot of metals into your wort, but a lot of those metals they get right back into the grain and then get left behind. But there's still a lot that go through into your kettle. And then, that's like manganese, copper, iron. And then through the process of the boil and fermentation, you'll see a drop even more of those metals. Different yeast strains might uptake more iron than others. I think I haven't seen a lot of research, but some on lager yeast are pretty good at it. And really, I was shocked by how little it takes to cause problems and how little it takes in the research to have a sensory impact on beer. So in this study, they found that 10 micrograms a liter can act as a catalyst and cause oxidation problems. When that's with iron, iron is probably the most important when it comes to long-term shelf stability of beers, and they can have like the largest impact on radical formation. And so if you look at, they're in this paper here on the chart on the right, they did brewed beers with different grists and let it ferment out and tested for iron. And the 100% Pilsner malt beer had about 50 micrograms a liter, which is right on that edge of where they determined you can start to have an unpleasant kind of metallic off flavor, which was a little surprising to me. I think that figure is probably a little low when it comes to like heavy, like huge imperial stouts or super dry hop beers, because it's competing with so much more. But I know a lot of times in our like low gravity stouts, or even some of our mixed firm beers that are lightly hopped, and I'll get into why that might matter in the next slide. I get a metallic kind of flavor that's a little off-putting to me in those beers. And so that's, not just shelf life, but thinking of ways to pull that back a little bit, I think is important. But you can see the specialty malts have a tendency to give way more final iron content in beer. I mean, the 50% Carapils with the Pilsner base was about, you'd see it's 50 micrograms a liter, then jump to like 350. And that's same with like some roasted malt. It wasn't quite as bad, and Cara 120, which wasn't quite as bad. The paper did sort of guess that the specialty malts just probably aren't as good at like reuptaking those metals and leaving them behind in the grist. That was kind of one explanation for it. And then a big factor was the pH they found. So the higher the mash pH, the less iron was extracting into the beer. And so they were jumped from like a 6, had a 40% less iron than like a 5.1 pH mash, which is pretty interesting. And that's something I'll probably start to experiment with in some of our hoppy beers, because we're generally pretty low because we know we're going to be dry hopping so heavily, and that's going to raise the pH. But maybe going a little higher in the mash, and then just adding more like phosphoric acid or something in the kettle to compensate. So this was a paper in the book, but this just looks at a little closer about mash hopping. And mash hopping is something a lot of people look at as sort of like a different type of bitterness, or a more pleasant, smooth bitterness. But the research to me just has us at the brewery doing it in pretty much every beer now, and it's really for this stability issue. This paper in particular looked at mash hopping, and in this case they did it enough to get like 20 to 25 IBUs, and they got a nearly 30% reduction in iron levels by doing that. So the alpha acids in the hops themselves were able to help precipitate out those metals. And of course, the less iron, the better in the long run. But more importantly in this paper, they also looked at the staling aldehydes when they force aged it. So they went 12 weeks at 82 degrees, which is 28 degrees Celsius, and they found a twofold decrease in staling aldehydes in the mash hop beer versus the non-mashed hop beer, which is pretty significant. So those alpha acids are doing a pretty good job in that case of pulling out some of those metals. And I think they also found that the higher the pH, the better it was at extracting those. So maybe adding some of those alpha acids in before adjusting for your mash pH might be beneficial. In terms of IBUs from a mash hop, this particular paper saw about a little over 20% utilization rate, as you would from a 60-minute edition. And I know Omega's done some research on this, and they're closer to about 30%. So you're still getting some IBU pickup, and it's something to consider, but it's not crazy. And in terms of this paper, like how much hops does it actually take to get to that in the mash? It was about 0.4 pounds a barrel. So using Columbus as an example, you would need about 4 pounds in a 10-barrel batch to reach that target. So, and that's about 1.5 grams a liter in the mash. This is one that's interesting to me from a paper in 2021. So let's say you want to try to chelate some of these metals in the mash, but you are worried about IBUs. In this particular case, they used a bunch of food-safe products to see what might be pretty good at complexing some of these metals. And in this case, they found that pomegranate extract at 90% ellagic acid was like really good at dropping these iron content. So in this chart on the right, you can see the mash started at about 220 micrograms a liter and dropped all the way down to about 50, which is close to where a lot of the previous study found at final fermented levels. So that's pretty impressive. And this was using about 60 milligrams a liter. So I mean, I looked online, you can find it, pomegranate extract, for about $80 for about 500 grams. And if my math is correct, that's only about 60 grams of this in a 10-barrel batch to really drop the iron content. So that's something we're going to also be experimenting with quite a bit in the future here. Looking again at grain and how it can impact some of the outcome of how your hops are perceived. For us, with our direct fire system, we get quite a bit of Maillard reactions, caramelization from the kettle, to a point where I think a lot of times some of our hop character can become a little, like if we're being pretty we're looking at our beers pretty closely. I think that the malt can almost be like a muddled hop character from it. It just kind of like, it doesn't allow the hops to shine and kind of pop. And so this is something I'm always trying to keep my eye on when it comes to the research to see kind of what's out there in terms of how we can keep this down. And this is a recent one that is interesting in that this paper found that as they increased the magnesium content during the boil, they found a higher Maillard reaction was being formed. And so, for me, again, if you're like a steam system, this probably isn't relevant to you, but looking at which grains had a higher amount of magnesium, which might cause more of those reactions, more of that caramelized finished product from the grist. It's interesting that like malted wheat and malted rye are one of the highest in terms of total magnesium that can get into your beer. We use malted wheat in almost all of our IPAs, so this was interesting to me. Maybe if we drop that out or replace it with flaked, for example, might be a better way to just get a cleaner kind of grist profile. Again, because it's all about kind of, you need that base grain thing in there to have a complex, balanced beer, but it's about the hops, right? And so that's kind of where I'm at with this. The authors speculated in this case that the higher magnesium content reduced the mobility of the wort, which would increase the reactions during the boil. I'm sure they'll be doing some more research into that, but again, if you have a direct fire system and you think you're maybe getting a little more color pickup than you want, or just kind of a muddled hop character from the grain, maybe try experimenting with some of these flaked products instead, or flaked rice was extremely low, so that might be a good one to throw into some of these IPAs. Moving on to dry hopping, I've been more and more convinced with the research and through our experience that cold dry hopping is, at least in our case, the way to go. Most of our sales are in the tasting room. The kegs are kept cold. Our cans are all kept cold. So, hop creep is always a worry. There is less enzyme activity in colder dry hopping, but obviously there still might be some of those enzymes in there that could cause issues. But we've, knock on wood, have never had any issues. Even when we, QC some of our cans warm, we haven't seen any hop creep with our current process that I'll talk about. But why cold dry hop? The research that's really convinced me is that when you're looking at the different temperatures, so 34, 39 to 68 degrees, 1, 4, 20 Celsius, looking at dry hopping and what's being extracted, they found that those colder temperatures really wasn't impacting the extraction rate of the things that we're after, like the monoterpene alcohols, like linalool and geraniol. And on top of that, even at those colder temperatures, they're still extracting quickly. So as little as like 2 days, they would pretty much max out. And on the other hand, the warmer you dry hop, they found an increase in some of those hydrocarbons that would be extracted, and those are those greener, resinous, woody compounds. And so and on top of that, also there was a higher amount of polyphenols that were being extracted. So in this particular study, they found a twofold increase in polyphenols at 66 degrees versus 39. And of course, a lot of polyphenols can lead to a more astringent finish. And at some of our dry hopping rates, we're getting plenty of those as it is. And they have found an even higher increase in polyphenols for the higher alpha hops in this case too. I think that was closer to 3-fold increase at the warmer temperatures. So, and then this chart here just takes a look at which compounds in particular were increasing at the warmer dry hop, and just the description of those compounds. And to me, that's helpful. It's like resinous, woody, spicy, balsamic, varnish, green. Those are the kind of compounds I like to keep down in a dry hop. I'm looking for like the fruity thiols, the monoterpene alcohols. Those are the things I'm trying to push. So cold dry hopping, you're still getting quick extraction. You're getting extractions of the compounds I think you want. and you're keeping down some of those compounds that I think can be a little distracting and kind of lead to a more astringent finish in beers. So this is our I'll just kind of walk through what we're currently doing in terms of dry hopping. And of course, I like to say like in a year from now, it'll probably be completely different because we're always kind of changing these things. But almost all of our dry hopping now is done post-fermentation. We're letting it completely finish out, and then we'll soft crash to 13 degrees Celsius. We'll then usually leave it there for a couple days, harvest yeast, and then be pretty aggressive getting the yeast out. And I think that's probably a big part of our colder dry hopping kind of working in terms of hop creep. We're really pretty aggressive on dropping as much yeast as possible. We'll do our first round of, then we'll actually after that we'll drop it all the way down to 34 degrees. So that's the temperature, 1 degree Celsius. That's where we're doing almost all of our dry hopping now. We just kept going down and down and down. We just noticed we were getting less of that green character, some of that, that harsher finish when the lower we were going. And it really wasn't impacting what we were after with the hops at those colder temperatures. So we'll do one round we usually do 2 rounds of dry hopping. The first round we'll do at 34 degrees. We do it through this hop doser you can see on the right. I think you've probably all seen a lot of those where you can add the hops, purge them, and then open up a valve to the tank and add them in a closed manner. And then we'll wait about an hour, kind of let the hops kind of percolate down. And then at this point, we've been blowing off the tank completely, so there's no pressure on. And we'll do an aggressive burp from the bottom with a high flow regulator, so for about 2 minutes, just really blasting those hops. And we'll leave the arm open for about an hour at this point. And I wish you could see inside the tank, but we're really kind of hoping that as we just blasted through the bottom, CO2 is trying to come out of solution. Hopefully it's kind of keeping some of those hops up in the beer so they can extract a little bit. And then we'll close the arm after about an hour, and we'll leave it closed at that point. And then with each burp, we'll just adding more pressure on the tank. We'll do that. Burp the day we dry hop, burp again the next morning, and then that night we're dropping those hops out. And then we'll drop them out again the next morning, do our second round of dry hopping, and then again burping, and then we unit tank all of our beers, so we're constantly removing them from the bottom of the tank to try to clear it up. This has really been beneficial to us in some of our lower ABV beers, this colder temperature. That's where we're getting the most kind of harsh character from it. And then the higher alcohol beers, you get higher dry hop extraction anyways from just higher ABVs. There's a paper that looked at, I think it was like a non-alcoholic beer and a 5% and an 8% beer, and they just kept seeing a higher percentage increase of extraction of the monoterpene alcohols at those different temperatures. So that's where we're at right now with dry hopping, and like I said, it'll probably change, but we're going pretty cold and it's working pretty well. This is kind of the last area here that I'll just kind of throw out there as some research to think about and something to maybe experiment with. Dry hopping with pellets is really not that efficient. There's some research here that I kind of graphed out that just shows, after dry hopping, what's left in the hop. And you can see that, in terms of like linalool and geraniol, there's about 45% of those oils were extracted from the hops into the beer, which leaves close to 60% of that still in the pellet. And in terms of just like total oil, you can see that in this case Amarillo is still had about 55% of the oil still in it. Centennial also a little over 50%. And we compost all of our hops after we're done with them, and you can tell that there's a lot still in there when you drop it from the tank. They still smell really good, and it's just kind of a bummer, but you just kind of get rid of them and move on. But there was a paper last year that actually looked at reusing these spent hops and kind of putting them in front of a sensory panel, as well as kind of testing some of the compounds in them. And so what they did is they dry hopped a beer, harvested those hops. They actually rinsed them and then froze them until they were going to use them, and then made beers with them. They made beers with they either used them like fresh hops to bitter, and then fresh hops to like aroma hops, late hops. They did like a fresh hop, and then they would do like spent hops for bittering or spent hops for aroma hops, and just made a handful or 4 of these beers with a different, either all spent hops or a combination of spent and new, and tested them from a sensory panel, and also put them in front of some. Actually measured some of the compounds, and what they saw is they're still getting about 70% of the alpha was still in the hop. Obviously, you don't get a big alpha increase from dry hopping, so there's a ton of potential there. And in terms of the sensory, it was interesting that the beers made with the late hopped and the spent bittering hops and the spent aroma hops were some of the highest rated in terms of taste. Not surprising they weren't as high for aroma. But for just the overall bitterness, they really found that it was like less grassy, less resinous. I reached out to the author just to kind of see what else, if he had any other insights into it. And he just thought it was just a reduction of some of those greener resinous compounds that came out of extracted during the dry hop that don't come across in the whirlpool, and that's just made a cleaner bitterness beer. So something to think about, and also it's just kind of tying back to the iron and mash hopping. I think this would be a pretty easy way and cheap way to experiment with trying to complex some of those metals in the mash. If you a lot of the hops we're dry hopping with, they're high alpha. You're retaining 70% of them, 70% of the alpha in the hops. Why not take 5 pounds of that from a dry hop on a brew day, or if you're brewing, you're dropping hops, take 5 pounds of that and throw it in the mash. Doesn't seem crazy to me to experiment with that and see if you see a reduction, because you can send your beers for metal counts. That's a pretty cheap and easy thing to do, and so maybe experimenting with some of this stuff, sending in your current beers, and then add some of these mash hops, or in this case, spent hops, and see if you're getting a reduction. And hopefully, if you are, you're seeing an increased shelf life on those beers too. I think it makes sense to, if you're dry hopping with some of those high survivable hops, to, if you're going to do this, maybe use those spent hops in the mash or whirlpool. If they have a higher amount of these hops that are sticking around, it seems like you'd have a better chance of having that happen again the second go around. I would imagine they still have a lot of thiol precursors for bound thiol precursors. So maybe if you're using a strain like Cosmic Punch, where you're trying to push precursor load a little more, it might be something worth trying too. And I did ask him too, because I was a little worried about using spent hops. So I reached out to the guy in the study and just said, hey, there's might be yeast or some other stuff in there. How worried are you about rinsing these? And he was like, he didn't see a huge problem with it. He's like, you might see potentially higher fusel alcohols with like some of the yeast that's in there. But if you're really doing a good job dropping yeast, it's probably not a huge problem. If you're freezing them, it might I don't know how much it would drop your whirlpool temperature, but that's kind of a bonus. So really I don't know, I like to use this research is it's like a lot of this stuff, you're like, I don't know, that seems kind of dumb. Like no one's really doing this. But that's, kind of the fun of it, when you have your own brewery and you can do a lot of, side experiments and see what happens. And so I kind of like to just throw stuff at you and see if anything sticks or if anything resonates or if you have any issues that some of this stuff might be worth exploring. And that's how I use it at the brewery. And so if any of you guys end up doing some of this stuff, please reach out to me and let me know kind of how it turns out. So I think that was pretty much it for me. And then I don't know if we're doing questions, but
you've got 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Scott, the metal content in the different malts.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any research into, my wife said it was in the soil science area, so I'm a bit nerdy about this. Was there different research done into the different metal contents between the malt origins, for example, European, American, New Zealand, wherever?
There might be papers on that. I'm not 100% sure. In this case, they just kind of used what they had. And but I would think there would be even between different suppliers. In that one, you could see, I think I can go back, right? So just right in this one here, you can see flaked oats has a little bit, and then there's another flaked oats that's quite a bit higher. And so I do think there's probably some big swings in a lot of this. So, I don't know if that's something that's you can request from the supplier. I don't know if that's something they have, but yeah, I think it's just like hops in different areas. They're different, right? Yeah.
I was curious with the cold dry hopping, seeing less astringency, less polyphenols, more of those fruit characteristics. Do you find that you sort of have to up your dry hopping level, almost in the sense that like we're so accustomed and used to kind of grungy dankness, the same way that if you put a Corona in a brown bottle, it doesn't taste like Corona anymore because it's missing a bit of skunk. How do you sort of keep the fullness or the dankness? Do you find that you have to increase the dry hopping level?
Well, dankness, I think that's just the hop you're using. I think you're just getting that from, the variety. It's more that grassy, resinous thing that I think can be a little off-putting, kind of like makes you don't want to keep going back for another drink in some of those. I will say though, at that colder temperature, I think those hops are encouraged to drop to the bottom of that tank extremely quick, and that's where agitating, we burp, or recircing, or however you do it, is more important at those colder temperatures because they drop out so quickly. I've noticed that especially on our smaller vessels. If I do like a 5-gallon, or what is that, 19-liter, like just test batch, I'll see like those hops are dropping to the bottom super quick at a cold temperature. So agitating and rousing those is important. This is helpful for us too on a smaller scale. We don't have a centrifuge, and so we're trying to keep a lot of this stuff down as much as we can. If you're centrifuging your beer, there's been research that shows that you're stripping a lot of those like myrcene and hydrocarbons, and the thiols and the monoterpene alcohols aren't really as impacted, so you're kind of doing that mechanically, and we're trying to just do it through what we have at the brewery. And so if colder temperatures gets us part of the way, we also biofine all of our beers, including our hazy IPAs. I think that helps kind of clear them up and drop some of those compounds down a little bit. So for us, it's just worked, but we're just trying to, work with our equipment.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.